Welcome to California in Focus. I'm David Mastio. Today, we're talking about events at UCLA. Joining me is Kenneth Schrutt, a California reporter for the Center Square. Kenneth, so tell me what's going on at UCLA.
After rising tension and violence between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine protesters at UCLA, the pro-Palestine encampment in UCLA was cleared out by police, resulting in hundreds of arrests, although from what I've heard, those arrested were immediately released with the little ticket telling them to appear in court someday.
You mentioned that there was violence between pro-Palestinian protesters and counter-protesters. What can you tell me about that?
That's right. In the days before the encampment's clear out, counter-protesters began arriving in larger numbers and began to get into exchanges of words that eventually became exchanges of fists with pro-Palestine protesters. Police didn't show up for hours on the worst night of fighting, which was the night before the encampment clear up. And when they did arrive, they kind of waited by for some time before eventually separating the two groups, but not taking further action.
Yeah, I read that sometimes they were using weapons, batons, and pieces of wood.
Yes, it was very caveman-like. We saw people trying to beat each other with metal pipes, wooden boards that might have had nails in them. It was very, very nasty. But at the same time, you also saw groups of protesters pulling the most violent individuals back, almost as if they're unspoken code of conduct where people wouldn't do anything that would really get anyone into too much physical harm or potential felony charges. When one protester, really couldn't tell if it was a pro-Palestine or pro-Israel protester, was struck in the head by a metal baton. It was almost like things paused and he was allowed to be safely escorted out before the theater could resume again.
According to video that we posted, you could see the pro-Palestinian protesters preparing for violence.
Yes. A journalist I know flew a drone over the pro-Palestine encampment to capture hand-to-hand combat training within the pro-Palestine camp. You can see the video for yourself on our website.
Do we know who the counter-protesters were? Were they Jewish students, supporters of Israel?
Anecdotally, it does seem like there were a lot of non-students who were A, protesters, and B, counter-protesters. The counter-protesters do seem to be local Jewish residents. Remember, Los Angeles has one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. There's a vibrant, very traditional Jewish sector in the Robertson Pico area. These are a lot of people who have served in the IDF. They're not afraid to stand up for themselves and their rights and to even aggressively do so.
Kenneth, what are California legislators saying?
The California Assembly and Senate Republican leaders did have a press conference the day after the encampments were cleared out, saying that administrations at colleges are to blame for allowing these situations to develop in the first place. They cited examples where administrations provided food, helped provide security through barriers, and by not declaring unlawful assemblies have allowed these encampments to grow into problems that require hundreds of police, lots of overtime to get rid of. California Assembly Republican leader James Gallagher said, "It's the administration that needs to take the cut because we've got a whole lot of people at these universities who are drawing six-figure salaries and they stood by and did nothing as all this happened." So they're really calling for cuts to administration budgets at college campuses that they say have, quote, grown exponentially over the last 10 years. I believe at Stanford University now, there's a 1-to-1 administrator to student ratio. Also, it's worth noting that California does face a $73 billion budget deficit for this year. And historically, higher education is where most of the budget cuts have come from. During the Great Recession, half of the state's budget cuts were from education, and most of that was from the California UC and Cal State University system. I can imagine that something like this could happen again.
What is the Gavin Newsom administration doing about events at UCLA?
the administration has condemned any violence and chaos. They've condemned vandalism, and they've said that they are looking into what allowed this violence to take place in the first place, which, in other words, is very little.
So I'm going to preview some reporting that I'll do next week. But one of the clear things going on in protests around the country is there's a current of anti-Semitism in it. One of the ways that you see that is this chant from the river to the sea. And there are two congresswomen that have gotten in trouble for anti-Semitism in the past. And I looked into whether university professors in California were giving to these anti-Semitic congresswomen, Representative Rashida Tlaib from Michigan and Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. And I found that University of California professors had given more than $100,000 over the last 3 election cycle to those two congresswomen. It's really interesting that University of California professors would send their money to Michigan and Minnesota if they were unaware of the infamy of these two congressmen. One of them has been censured by Congress for anti-Semitism for putting out a video in which she used the "From the River to the Sea, Palestine Will Be Free" slogan, which some consider genocidal.
So one thing I would probably say is a reason for this is because UC staff members and faculty tend to pride themselves as being progressives, and those two members of Congress you mentioned are members of the quote-unquote squad, which is this group of very visible, very progressive female members of Congress. So you could definitely view some of these donations not directly as being anti-Semitic, but as being in support of this being visibly progressive, perhaps. However, though, I would say that there is a rhetoric in colleges that is very focused on intersectionality and speaking out against any groups that are perceived to have advantages in society. And this ideology has targeted America as an oppressive state and has also shifted to include Israel as well.
Kenneth, thank you for joining us. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.